Well, what lessons can firefighters teach corporate leaders? To talk about that, I'm joined by Melissa Swift. She's founder and CEO of Anthrome Insight. Melissa, thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me on. I'm really excited to talk about this article.
Yeah, I saw the article. It was the MIT Sloan Journal, right? And it kind of caught my attention because you're comparing corporate leaders and what they do to firefighters. And, corporate leaders do say they fight fires all the time, and you're not that impressed with their skills.
No, it was one of those, those like little linguistic things where you take a second and you step back and you notice it and you say, you know what? We say that all the time, but I can't quite, that's not quite right. So that sent me down a really interesting rabbit hole.
We should start by saying, you have the opportunity to work with leaders. Tell us a little bit about your own career and the work you do that puts you in touch with people.
So, for a while, I was a consulting leader for, big consulting firms like Mercer, Capgemini, Korn Ferry. And now I'm out on my own doing kind of similar work, very sort of data-driven, research-inflected, analytical work about how can we get to kind of practical solutions to do work better at a time when I personally believe work's gotten a lot harder to do. And some of that is the very technology that kind of fuels our progress has also in some ways made work harder too. So a lot of my career and my consulting work has been about kind of how do you hit that right balance where you're working right with technology, you're working properly with people, and how do you do it all in just a more crowded and chaotic environment?
Well, especially now, I mean, we're on the verge of this AI driven world, and some organizations are further ahead, some leaders are further ahead. I don't think it's helping the stress level. I'm not sure how you view it.
Oh, no, no, absolutely. Because I think some of it is that it's not a fully formed technology, and that's actually okay, right? Technology iterates in real time as we all test and learn on it. But I think part of what you're seeing is very mature expectations about how AI should be sort of fed through organizations with a fairly immature underlying technological product, but also a very again, this kind of crowded and chaotic world of work thing is going on where, it's not like we had this perfect, beautiful blank slate and we just dropped AI into it. No, things were already crazy. And then
Yeah.
you add one more thing, right? Which that's sort of the corporate life over the last, let's say, 10 to 15 years.
So, okay, so we have the analogy leaders say they're fighting fires, whether it was the pandemic or, having people working at home or technology. What made you decide to talk to an actual firefighter to see what they do?
So it's interesting. I have a to be announced soon, a book coming out about how to deal with all of this kind of work craziness. And I had a brainwave as I was framing it up that, in knowledge work, right? The kind of work that you do, I do, right? That a lot of us do. We might be doing things in a way that, if we had to do other jobs, would look really weird. And so I kind of took that lens about, are there other kinds of work that we're doing better? And I had an epiphany about high stakes work, right? You cannot screw up firefighting. You cannot screw up being an emergency room doctor. You cannot screw up being an air traffic controller. So I actually, for the book, went and interviewed all three folks. But this article really focused on, apart from what in the book, kind of some other like bonus learnings from my conversation with the wonderful New York, fire department firefighter who really, my brain lit up during this conversation. So it was a blast to write the article.
Well, I like how you broke it down into principles that firefighters use that corporate leaders don't use enough. So let's take those one by one. The first one is to do more scenario planning, which surprised me a little bit because I would think a lot of corporate leaders say, oh, no, we do scenario planning. Not enough?
I don't think we really utilize it as a tool. It's interesting. I was introduced to scenario planning kind of a million years ago when I was, I think, an intern at Morgan Stanley, a very, very long time ago. And one of the guys who'd actually worked on scenario planning I think, for one of the big oil companies came in and spoke to us. And it was this huge aha moment for me. So I had at a fairly young career age kind of the what it should look like really just illustrated beautifully during this presentation. And, so when we say we're scenario planning, maybe we'll talk a little bit about a what if, or maybe we kind of have an idea about how we'll do it. But the reality is, at the moment when we should be pausing and thinking about multiple possibilities, generally the way that we show leadership in corporate world is, well, this is what's going to happen and this is what we should do. So instead of doing, I'm also a big sci-fi reader, in science fiction, sometimes they talk about multiple branching futures, right? The future could go this way or the future could go that way. But we think corporate decisiveness is to say the future will only go this way. That's rarely true, right? It twists and turns and things happen that are weird. And we're constantly like, oh, that was so weird. I'm so surprised. And it's like, no, if we sat down and did a proper kind of scenario planning for 5 minutes, we might have anticipated that possibility. It wasn't so weird after all. But we don't do. And the fact that firefighters can do that in the context of a raging fire, they
Yeah.
can take 2 minutes and scenario plan, and we can't do that. We should be a little embarrassed.
Well, that's an excellent point. Like I said, from my vantage point, because my background, I still do this for companies, is economics, and it's more about projecting different scenarios. How will things look next year? But I guess it's not as widespread as we think.
No, that discipline is not, and what you just said is another wonderful example of, I think when we work well, we do that borrowing across silos. So to your point, economics has some real wisdom to bring to the corporate world, and a real discipline and a real way of looking at things that's practical and helpful. And so you're doing that. You're spanning those worlds and bringing knowledge from world one to world two. I don't think enough of that actually happens.
Interesting. Okay, your second principle, which I thought was really interesting, was you have to get real about role clarity. And that's okay, in my observation, it's not always very clear in the corporate world. There's a lot of overlap, but a lot of hurt feelings and everything else. How do firefighters do this?
So they've almost got kind of pre-packaged teams. And I like this construct because I think most corporate problems, there's not a million team constructs out there that could solve them. There's probably, let's say, 10 archetypical team constructs. I'm making that number up. But if you think about the really high performing teams you've worked on in your career, right? There are certain kind of types of roles and ways to put teams together that recur and that work really well. And so firefighters have that. If you're rappelling down a building, there's got to be a guy holding the rope. There's got to be a guy spotting. There's just, they have these team constructs in mind. And definitionally, you can't be doing two things at once. You can't be, like I talked about in the article, you can't be the guy that dives into the Hudson to save somebody. And also the guy standing on the edge of the water. You can't be both people. But in corporate world, they say, well, you're going to dual hat as, the spotter and the swimmer. No, don't do that. It's weird and it doesn't work. And to your point, a lot of the emotional friction we experience in the corporate world comes from just not setting down good role clarity. So one of two things happen. Either people's roles grind together, and particularly in a crisis situation, you really don't want that where two people are doing the same tasks, or tasks get dropped because the roles are too far apart. Nobody covered this ground and things just fall between two stools. And again, in a crisis, you don't want either one.
Well, I don't think you want the firefighters saying it's my turn to use the axe or whatever, right? Right.
Exactly.
Oh, Melissa, stay with me. We're just going to take a short break and we'll be right back.
If you're enjoying this conversation and want to bring insights like these to your next event, visit lindanazareth.com to book Linda Nazareth as your keynote speaker. Linda is an economist and futurist, and she is a dynamic and experienced speaker who has presented to audiences across a broad range of industries on the megatrends shaping the economy and the future of work. That's lindanazareth.com, or send an email to speaking@lindanazareth.com.
Okay, I'm back with Melissa Swift. We're talking about the lessons leaders can learn from firefighters. We've been through a couple, but I like this one too, which is genuinely know your tools and their potential. That is a huge thing when we talk about the corporate world, because we talked about this is a time when technology is changing. I don't know, from my vantage point, a lot of people are being overtaken by this.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we sort of discount, I think, sometimes how people actually learn to do anything. So, if you think about adult learning theory, right, that 70% of learning anything is on the job, 20% is from others, and 10% is training. Now, new AI technology, oh my God, everybody go do training. Okay, great. 10%, right? Where is the other 90% of the learning going to come from? And that's in the best case scenario where you are trained. Think of how many technologies you might use in a day that nobody ever trained you on, and that you're probably not really even necessarily using properly. I mean, we're on a Zoom right now. Did anyone ever train you on Zoom?
Yeah, no.
No. And you probably got some on the job and some learning from others, but there's a foundational stage setting that kind of never happened. And so we use all these tools and we're like okay with them and it's fine. And we don't account for how much friction and static that actually creates a whole workforce full of people who can kind of sort of use technology. And again, in firefighting world, that's not okay. You have to know every single way how to use an axe. It's you have to be, you can't just be like, oh, I kind of know how to use the hose. I sort of know how to drive the truck. No, that none of that goes on because that would be foolishness. But we think it's okay to, kind of have this mixed relationship with technology in the corporate world. And the reality is we probably need to come down to a smaller set of technologies in a day. I mean, I don't know if you've seen, but there's some good research from folks like Gartner that say that the number of apps, right, that you use every day has skyrocketed in recent years, like the last 5 years, very recently. And so some of what may need to happen is a better curation of the work technological environment so that we can use fewer tools and be better at them, be like the firefighters who know all the ways to use the axe.
But it's a cultural difference because obviously in the firefighting world, everyone knows training is important. You're not sending people out not knowing how to use their tools. I don't know that there's a buy-in in every company, every organization that we have to pay for training. And especially when the economy weakens, it's the first thing to go.
Absolutely. And again, to be fair, it's 10% of how we learn things, but it's a really important 10%. It sets the stage for the other 70%. And I think we also just don't have great mechanisms for on the job learning as well, that people a lot of times will learn enough to use a particular technology and then be using it sort of wrong their whole careers even. And we don't have mechanisms to kind of use the full sort of, again, like on the job learning from others and really strategically using training. Like we're not intentional about it.
Is mentoring a big deal with firefighters? If you can answer that, because I'm not sure it's a big enough deal in the corporate world.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the whole construction of how firefighters work together, I think, is very different. That you don't hear a lot about, well, like we're just in a serious horse race for who's going to make fire chief. It's not, there's, I think, a really good intuitive understanding, again, in high stakes work that either we do it together or we all fail. And it's interesting because that was a theme that I heard from, the air traffic controller I interviewed and from the emergency room physician that I interviewed, is that everyone sort of gets that unless you mentor the people around you, you're not going to have the best possible people to work with. And you need the best possible people to work with because you can't have any weak links in those critical chains of folks. And so there is just, I think, a greater intuitive culture of mentoring and to some degree less of the sort of like toxic superficial competition that again we see in the corporate world that sometimes shuts down even peer coaching or things like that.
Okay, so you've got those components in place, maybe. Your fourth piece of advice from the firefighters is over communicate and spur positive emotion. Talk about that.
Yeah, so it's interesting because that one was in such sharp contrast to me for how I have seen leaders behave in crisis scenarios, that a lot of times people's reaction is to go very negative, like we are behind for this quarter and you guys are screwing up, but if we don't get it together, and that energy just activates people's fight or flight. Right? So that this piece about we need to inject positivity at every, even if I don't perfectly feel it in every second, if we're all putting good energy in, generally speaking, it's people are less likely to kind of get panicky. Because there's already flames and stuff. They don't also need someone yelling at them. But this is what leaders miss is, right? People feel the crisis. They don't need you to come in screaming, and yet we come in screaming. And then the over communicating point, I think, is fascinating as well, because sometimes I think leaders are actually afraid to over communicate because they are afraid that if they communicate too much, it will show that they don't understand certain aspects of the situation. It's like, well, we all know what the problem is. Do we? Do we?
Yeah, I
Sure,
think especially now, I think a lot of workers think, well, I'm not being told enough, right? There's potentially layoffs, there's potentially concerns about the economy, and there's reasons for this. I mean, if you're a publicly traded company, you don't want to necessarily put out all this information all the time. Is that situation getting worse or better? The communications part of it?
I do believe it's a fine line. To your point, there are things you cannot communicate. But the best leaders, and it's interesting, some of the folks that I interviewed for my forthcoming book actually said this, some experts on communication, that they will communicate when they can't communicate. That, look, here are the things I can tell you, right? I'm going to give you all
Mm.
the facts I can. There are things I can't talk about right now, or there is nothing to talk about at this moment. Instead of letting people's brains make up the negative story, saying, okay, you know what? There's actually nothing going on. And that's good, useful information. Even saying the absence of anything to communicate, that it's actually helpful. But again, you have to be very secure to do that. And I think that's what leaders are lacking. Leaders don't feel strong in their skis right now with
No.
conditions kind of all over the map. And that leads them to kind of pull back and communicate less. Their teams get more anxious and everybody just goes into this big anxious swirl.
Okay, so if you were talking to leaders right now, and you are through the podcast and perhaps in person, what's the one piece of advice you'd give them? The thing that you learned from the firefighters or whoever else you interviewed that they can apply?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's that things are not as unpredictable as we often make them out to be. That was a big thematic that came out in the firefighting conversation, but also the other kinds of high stakes work as well. Is that roughly speaking, we are dealing with similar things over and over and over. That even crises, again, there's kind of certain kinds of crises that just recur. And part of what's throwing people off right now is there's all of this, especially around AI. This is unprecedented. Well, almost nothing in this world is unprecedented. Everything's pretty much precedented, whether you like it or not. So I think some of what high stakes work really gets right is the sense of things happen in similar patterns over and over. There are replicable patterns of events, and then there are replicable lessons and methodologies to deal with them. And if you think about it, it's similar to in child raising, right? That you don't, if your kids feel like, oh my God, the world's in crisis all the time, and I don't know what time dinner is going to be, and like you'd raise like messy kids, like your kids would not be in good emotional shape. You no, the world is predictable. We go to school at this time, we eat dinner at this time, we create predictability to raise healthy children. Similarly, communicating and creating predictability in corporate work builds healthy teams.
That's a good thought to leave it on, something that people hopefully can implement. Melissa, thank you so much for talking to me today.
This was great. Thank you for the opportunity to do so. It was a lot of fun.
Melissa Swift is founder and CEO of Anthrome Insight. Thanks for listening to Work in the Future. If today's episode sparked ideas for your organization, reach out. I would love to help you shape the future of work at your next event. To discuss your event and book me as a speaker or moderator, please visit lindanazareth.com or email speaking@lindanazareth.com. You can also visit me on Instagram at lindanazareth keynote speaker and send me a direct message there. If you did like this discussion about the future of work, please remember to subscribe to the podcast. Also, your reviews really help people to find us, so please make sure you take time to leave one wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much for listening. And as always, thank you to Stokely Audio for audio production.